Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Evnin Public Lecture, presented by Princeton University's Council on Science and Technology. I am Dan Truman, professor of music and a member of the council. I'm here on behalf of Naomi Leonard, who is the director of the council, but she's away on this semester on sabbatical. The support for the council's annual public lecture comes from the generous donation of Dr. Anthony Evnin, who was a Princeton class of 1962 and the managing general partner of the venture capital firm Venrock. Our council fosters university-wide engagement in science and engineering, exploring societal impact of science, engineering, and mathematics known as STEM, promoting innovative teaching and research and new ways to live at the intersections of STEM with the arts, humanities, and the social sciences. We seek to ensure that all students graduating from Princeton can be exemplary citizens, voters, and leaders with the ability to assess and appreciate the science and engineering issues of the day. I'm delighted to see you all here today, and tonight we have a wonderful guest and lecturer in store for you. Ge Wang is an engineer, a musician, a computer scientist, a designer, a teacher, an entrepreneur, and more. I had the pleasure of working with Ge when he was a graduate student here in computer science. While he was here, he co-founded the Princeton Laptop Orchestra, known as PLORC, with me and computer science professor emeritus Perry Cook. He also designed a new programming language specifically for music called Chuck. It's a language that has a beautiful sense of musical time built into its fundamental structure. Chuck is widely used in music circles and has been creatively transformative for my own work. After leaving Princeton, Ge joined the faculty at Stanford University's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, known as CARMA, where he is now an associate professor. At the time, in 2008, he also co-founded Smule, which became one of the first and most innovative developers of music-making apps for the iPhone. And remember, in 2008, the iPhone was less than a year old. Smule's apps include the Ocarina, I Am T-Pain, Glee Karaoke, the Magic Piano, and many others. All of them represent innovative and inspiring designs that have attracted literally millions of users. Smule's apps have more than 52 million active users. Is that true? Kind of crazy. At Stanford, Ge founded the Stanford Laptop Orchestra, known as SLORC, the Stanford Mobile Phone Orchestra, known as MoPhO, and he leads a research team of graduate students, and he also teaches courses on design, music, sound, and more. Most recently, Stanford University Press published his book, Artful Design, Technology in Search of the Sublime, the subject of his talk today. So without further ado, please welcome our 2019 Evnin Lecture, Ge Wang.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Council on Science and Technology at Princeton, and thanks to all of you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in, and again, we'll start the story kind of in media res. This is me in my office at Stanford, at CARMA, the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. As Dan said, what I do is I make things. I design tools, toys, games, social experiences, musical instruments, all of which kind of in the service of like helping people to, express and be creative. I work on programming languages. I write a lot of code. In fact, that's kind of my preferred medium. This is kind of the craft. I feel like that is my first craft, is really just coding, writing code in service of making things that do stuff. And I'm going to give you some examples of this. And yes, I work with the Laptop Orchestra. When I joined the faculty at Stanford, PLORC was kind of brought, the idea of PLORC was brought to the West Coast. And even though, part of me felt obligated to change some things just to make it different, I then decided actually nothing really needed to change. So we basically just wholesale copied everything that basically was working in PLORC, which I thought was everything, because what changed in the Laptop Orchestra year after year, actually the people, the musical sensibilities, the music. And so in a way, I think is the way that Dan and Perry set this up, is that this is a meta medium for design. And really, its evolution is a continued kind of process and a function of the people that are actually in it. And I'll give you some examples of this as well. And yeah, I design things like apps that are instruments, possibly toys, possibly both, possibly neither. And so that's what I do. But I'm going to rewind now, further back in time, actually to when I was born, like 40 years ago. I was born in Beijing, and I grew up in that building right there. In fact, on that floor where the arrow is pointing to. I grew up with my grandparents, and that's me at the age of 4. My parents were actually working in other parts of the country. This is really kind of recently after the Cultural Revolution in China. And actually, Mom, like I was impressed and pleased to learn, was building cars as an engineer in a factory. Beijing is my hometown, and just it's gotten a lot more polluted and congested, in recent years, but it still has its moments. In fact, I was just there 10 days ago. This is April 6th. On this day, my grandmother turned 100. She was born in Beijing 1919 and on April 6th. So she's doing great. We regularly exchange texts and we FaceTime sometimes, and she sends me photos of a lot of things. So she's well connected, and we're connected by technology. Now, as a designer, I think back to wow, when did I really start designing things? And what is the first artifact of design that I designed? And I think maybe it was this. It was actually these bricks made out of mud I found downstairs from that building. Why was I doing this? What is the purpose of this? I think I was trying to make gold bars, in my mind. So I would take this mud, carefully mold them into these rectangular bars. I would wrap them up carefully in newspaper, store them under the bed for weeks on end to dry, in kind of a blunt alchemistic attempt to literally make money. And then I tried to pawn these off on my friends, which did not work. But I was a weird kid. But actually, as we may all agree, perhaps, that all kids are weird, if you think about it, right? We do things that make no sense to our future selves. But also, I think that is what makes childhood so wonderful and uninhibited, is that kids are beholden to nobody, and they get to be themselves, right? And as we all grow up, I think all of us struggle to kind of keep that playful part of us, still within us. And so, in a way, this kind of reflects kind of an ethos and a value system that I tried to also hold on to and also express and expand in the kind of things I design. And a lot of that is informed also by the things I played with as a child, like video games. I grew up on comic books. I still play video games. StarCraft 2, really good game. Just playing it last week. And I think, when I was growing up, I didn't have a lot of money, but I would go to the arcades and I would watch other people play video games because I was just attracted to the glowing pixels on the screen. It's just mesmerizing, and it is still mesmerizing to this day. And I think this informs kind of what I end up doing. And as they say, we are fashioned by the things we love. And I loved video games. I love comic books. I moved to the US when I was 9 years old. My parents, like my grandparents, really kind of encouraged me to just follow whatever it is that I'm interested in, but also to try to discover what it is that I'm actually interested in. They got me a guitar at the age of 13, which completely transformed my life. Previous to that, I did play an instrument. It was the accordion, which I started learning at the age of 7, which then I abandoned at the age of 10. And I love the accordion as an instrument, but they gave me not an acoustic guitar, but an electric guitar. At the age of 13, this seems like a rather dangerous thing to do, to arm your offspring with the instrument of rebellion. But I think maybe this is wise in that by preemptively doing so, they've kind of took the fun out of rebelling by sanctioning it. So I was actually a pretty good kid, but I loved playing my guitar. And I realized, I think, with the electric guitar that, music is awesome. Listening to music is awesome, but making music, now that's a joy all its own. And I grew up with a lot of, well, not a lot, but a few good friends who with whom I played a lot. And I think actually thinking back then to now, I feel like life in high school has gotten way harder today, where people are way more worried about what's next and how that is going to shape your decisions in the present. In fact, I think this isn't just high school. I think as early as elementary school, we're now worried about how our children what they should be doing to best prepare them for their college application. But I think I was fortunate in that I lived in a time where it was less, there's less pressure to do that. And went to undergrad, studied computer science because it seemed like a fun thing to do. I like to build things. It was kind of the digital version of mud with which I can fashion things. And really I learned there that, well, when you're studying anything, actually you're studying more than just the discipline. When I was learning computer science, I remember my professor saying, hey, there are two good answers to just about any question. I don't know, and it depends. Now, this is a really good rule in software engineering because, the trade-offs really depend on the situation at hand. But, this is also a pretty good life rule to kind of gauge every situation and respond to that situation. And then I went to grad school here. And this is the Sound Lab. And that's Perry, my advisor in computer science. And really who taught me everything from sound synthesis to making musical interfaces, but also kind of a certain zen in actually shaping technology to kind of fit the kind of life we want to live, musically speaking. And then of course there was Plork, where Dan really motivate this by observing, well, the notion of a laptop orchestra is seemingly paradoxical. That's the case is one of my primary motivations for creating one. The pairing of these two inventions is perhaps obvious only because of its apparent impossibility. One is an almost archaic institution whose continued existence is something of a miracle. The other is a technological newcomer that has become commonplace and seems likely to be with us, at least in some form, for quite some time. One serves to perform primarily European music from centuries ago, while the other is a convenient tool for editing text, crunching numbers, browsing the web, and checking email. Never the twain shall meet. Now this, looking back to this is about 2005, is really the ethos and the values that are set in place. This isn't like, hey, here's some laptops. People are using laptops. Let's use them to make music. No, this is trying to be thoughtful about why we would do such a thing, but also noting and reflecting on the incongruities and actually working with those in terms of how we shape the instruments and letting those instruments shape the music we would want to make. So more on the Laptop Orchestra later. And then Chuck, that ended up being my PhD dissertation here, and several of my committee members actually sitting in the audience. So I feel thankful that you graduated me, and slightly intimidated, but I'm going to give a demo of Chuck, and it's like the same demo you guys saw 11 years ago, or something very like it. But so this is Chuck, and in Chuck, how many people here actually write code? Raise your hand. A good number of them. If you've never written code before, do not worry. Chuck is named after both the action to throw somewhat carelessly, but also kind of seem like your friend, Chuck, right? So let's make a sign-off. I'm going to call the sign-off Dan. And I'm going to chuck Dan using the chuck operator into the DAC, which is an abstraction for the sound output, right? And Dan, if I may, I'm going to set your frequency to 440. Is that okay? Would you? Okay, great. So 440 chuck to Dan dot freak. That's the frequency, and I'm going to let time pass for 2 seconds. Now, if things work and there's no bugs in here, there's Dan at 440 hertz for 2 seconds. Now, in Chuck, as you see here, is that this is a language which you have to advance time in order for sound to happen. This is what we end up calling a strongly timed programming language, that you have to deal with time to actually have sound. But if you think about it, that kind of makes sense because sound is inherently a time-based medium. So you can kind of take this kind of thinking and, we'll multiply this twice, and we'll half the frequency here. We'll double it here. We'll say we'll do this for half a second, 1 second. What do we expect to hear now? Well, we're actually making successive octaves. All right, thank you, Dan. And now, Dan, I must apologize because we're about to put you into an infinite loop. And I feel like in the working of Chuck and writing my dissertation, I've written more infinite loops than perhaps most people. But here is the same sequence, now repeating ad infinitum. This is going to go on for a very long time, unless we stop it. In this case, instead of actually hard-coding the frequencies, I'm going to say math.random2f, generate a random number between 30 and 1,000, set that as Dan's frequency. And now we can switch it up and do this every half a second, every 200 milliseconds, every 100 milliseconds. I would like to pause here and note that we've created computer music. This is the sound that, computers like in old sci-fi movies, they're supposed to make when they're thinking really hard. They're computing. This is the sound of computation, right? Let's keep going though. 10 milliseconds. Still just one sine wave, 1 millisecond. So this is basically we modulate Dan's frequency 1,000 times a second, right? And here, we cross also an interesting perceptual threshold, which we stopped perceiving individual bleeps and bloops and started perceiving a continuous carpet, if you will, of sound. So that's Chuck. You can use the same timing mechanism by design to work with control of sonic parameters at different time scales. And in fact, you can the way to read Chuck code is to pretend you are the machine running this code. You're embodying the code. That's the mindset to use in the mental model, if you will, in reading Chuck code. And we can go the other direction. 1 millisecond, 1 second. You can go like every minute, hour, day, week. You can also say 52 week is my notion of a year in Chuck, and every 1,000 years, Dan will have a new frequency. Right, so this, again, time scales, but the same timing mechanism really applies. And so added with the concurrent programming aspects of Chuck, you can actually do this in parallel, thereby giving you a means to do multi-rate, simultaneous threads of sonic computation, really at the same time. So that, in a nutshell, is a bit of Chuck. And still working on Chuck. I thought I'd be done 15 years ago, but it's probably never going to be done. So and that brings us back more or less to the present. And 3 years ago, I started writing the aforementioned book, Artful Design. I started writing this for a number of reasons. And what started as a book on computer music and design, designing instruments, toys, and games around computer music, became a larger, broader meditation on design itself as a human activity. More specifically, it was a meditation on design as a humanistic, artistic, and social act of engineering. What if that is how I think about design? What if that is the way that we could think about design? And what also started as a more conventional text-based book became something different. And when I realized I have a lot of figures, and also I grew up on comic books, what if that could be the mode, the medium, the format with which I can really, not only talk about, illustrate, but also embody the very topics that the book is actually talking about, design. And so it became what started at those things has become a 488-page photo comic book. That's pretty much every page. It looks very different, but they are all in this way. And really, the three primary questions that is asked here is: 1, what is the nature of design? 2, what does it mean to design well? And 3, what does it mean to design ethically? These are, I think, the three overriding prevailing questions that kind of pervade the entire book. So let's look at each of these kind of a little bit more specifically. One, design, the nature of design. First thing I'll note is that it's actually all around us, right? And this is in the buildings, in the clothes, in this room, the chairs, the tables, the system, the software we use. But I'm going to illustrate this with something that has actually not a lot of advanced technology. It has some technology in it, and that's my pencil bag. All right, so this pencil bag is actually something I've had since 2013 as my pencil bag. I found it at Walmart in North Carolina. And first thing you notice that it has eyes, making it already kind of different than most other pencil bags. When you unzip it, it also has teeth. And by the way, you can't help but see the face in this, right? This is anthropomorphism working in design. You can't help but actually see that as a face, but there's more. You can take the zipper, and you can keep on going and unzip the entire bag until it becomes one single zipper. What the heck? Or perhaps why? What is the purpose of the pencil bag, which has a very clear purpose? What's the purpose of the pencil bag becoming its own zipper? Actually, would anyone like to offer an answer to this? Yes? Play. It's about play. Yes. This actually, like, play is a great answer, because play, kind of by definition, is a thing that needs no other purpose. You don't play for the sake of something else. You play to play. So there's an intrinsic quality to this thing being playful, even though it could serve in other ad hoc, more practical, it could be like a belt, an emergency rope, right? And Perry once offered that maybe someone was just like some poor designer was just looking at like a huge warehouse full of surplus zippers. And they're like, what do we do with this? But no, I think I like your answer. This serves no other purpose. And I think this highlights, I think, a crucial duality in design, is that it does serve a purpose. This is a pencil bag. But something in the way that it serves that purpose can't help but actually have another dimension to it, an intrinsically interesting and intrinsically valuable dimension. And so that's the pencil bag. And I actually, the moment I realized in Walmart that the pencil bag is also its own zipper, I stood there transforming this thing like quite a few times. And it was probably the only moment of, I would say, the sublime I encountered inside a Walmart. But it was true. It was a moment of clarity that I had. So the nature of design. Well, artful design gives this working definition of design, that design is an act of alignment. We design to bring the world into pragmatic alignment with what we consider to be useful and into aesthetic alignment with our notion of what's good and beautiful, or the way things ought to be. Within this creative endeavor are real, rich, expressive opportunities to speak to our human dimension. Right? So design is this act of alignment, but it's twofold. It's useful on the one hand, but also in alignment with the way we would want things to be, and bring the world ever closer to that vision. So here's another story of design, and this is Ocarina, and this is the first instrument I designed as part of SMUL. This is back in 2008, and it is a toy, also an instrument for your iPhone. I'm blowing to the microphone, and inside is a Chuck script that's actually tracking the strength with which I'm blowing to the microphone. It's also synthesizing the sound. Now, the strength I'm blowing to the microphone is actually modulating the synthesized sound, and that's giving us kind of the definition for these notes that we're hearing. Accelerometer is mapped to vibrato. So if I hold it flat versus, you get some vibrato if you tilt it down. And I can play little ditties with this. And well, it's a toy, but it's also something you can learn to get better at in terms of how you play it. Now, the design of Ocarina is not complex. You don't see any external housing actually rendered here. It's just the functional parts of playing with which you play the ocarina, right? And the statement here is that your phone is not just emulating an ocarina, your phone is the ocarina. A physical thing, right? And this kind of goes against this idea that, hey, well, most things we do on our phone are used like this, or like that, or like that. But this one's like, you gotta hold your phone as you might a sandwich and blow into it. And so that's the, and also what we see here is that these these quadruplets of circles are actually ocarina in gameplay mode. These are hinting as to how you play the next note for this particular piece, right? But how you express these notes is actually completely up to you. So in this way, it's actually very much like an ocarina hero, like Guitar Hero, but it's also different because the sound is not pre-recorded. It's something that you are expressing kind of in real time, and no two playing of the same songs is quite the same. Now there's another dimension to the design of Ocarina, and that is a social dimension. Within Ocarina, you can listen to other people blow into their phones from around the world. Here is Anonymous playing O Shenandoah from the East Coast. Who are these people? We don't know. The app was designed, in fact, to not tell you, right? You are really just here to listen. Here's someone from Indonesia playing the Legend of Zelda theme song. Who is this person? Again, we don't know. But they've given themselves a name, but that's kind of all we know. We know their location, we know kind of the moniker they've given themselves, and also the music they're playing. So, in a sense, this is a kind of music-mediated anonymous social network, where it's not about the identity of who's doing these things. It's actually about that there's someone doing these things at all. There's someone somewhere out there playing Oh Susanna, and that's all you know, that's all you kind of need to know in this app. And if you think about it, if you really knew, like, okay, that's this person's name such and such, and this is their hobby, and does that really matter in Ocarina? I would argue perhaps no. In fact, it might even detract from the experience of simply just listening and wondering who that person really is, right? And this anonymity actually lends a sense of, I think, added connection. And you might be wondering, hey, are people listening to me when I'm listening to this? So this is designed as a kind of social experience, right? The philosopher John Stuart Mill once said that eloquence is heard, but poetry is overheard. This is not a social model with which you do some things and you put it out there and you go back to check to see how many people liked it. This is something you simply put out there. And also things that you find and stumble that other people have put out there, right? So this is a different kind of social. And if there's a philosophy behind the globe in Ocarina, it might be this, that technology should create calm. Mark Weiser, he was once the CTO of Xerox PARC in the 80s and 90s, and often regarded as kind of the forerunner of ubiquitous or pervasive computing. And he had this vision, right? This is a remarkable statement. It's not saying technology is going to solve all our problems one day. It's going to be glorious, but rather that technology, this is how we might live with technology. It doesn't have to be in our faces all the time, but rather it might even help us to be more calm. It can induce and create calm. A user from Ocarina left this as a review for the app in iTunes in 2009. This is my peace on Earth. I'm currently deployed in Iraq, and hell on Earth is an everyday occurrence. The few nights I may have off, I'm deeply engaged in this app. The globe feature that lets you hear everybody else in the world playing is the most calming art I've ever been introduced to. It brings the entire world together without politics or war. It is the exact opposite of my life. Right? Now, as a designer, anyone that makes anything for someone else, you know how good it feels when anyone uses what you've made. It's a great feeling. Now this is like that, but like kind of another level. It's like we didn't think that someone would have this kind of reaction to it. It's like inadvertently we well, Ocarina was not going to do anything like practical for this soldier. It's not going to pluck them from the chaos and hell they've found themselves in, but for a moment, maybe it elevated them, gave them a moment of peace from it, and that is intrinsically valuable. So, in a way, this is kind of Ocarina, which has a purpose. It's kind of an instrument, maybe a toy, maybe a social experience, but there's something about it that you would hope offers people something beyond kind of the sheer functionality of what it's supposed to be. So this is all to say, I think good design enables us. It's useful. But great design seeks a kind of understanding of who we are, right? And this, I think, gets at this question of what do I mean when I say artful design? What makes design artful? It's actually, I think, something about the way you design something actually communicates something about who we are. Like, this is it's like whatever great art is. What is great art? Well, I don't know. I can't define great art, right? And but I might tell you that great art is not when you've understood like what's so great about the art, but rather when you feel like the art has understood you, right? Think about like your favorite song, or like a favorite film, right? These things, these artifacts, right? They perhaps understand something about who you are, who you were, or your relationship with another person, and I think that is art. It brings about this kind of understanding, and can design do this? That is the question. So I'm going to give you another example here, and this one is this one started off as a Stanford Laptop Orchestra piece called Converge, created by June Oh and myself. She was undergrad at Stanford, then later a PhD student at Karma. And we started off making a Stork instrument, but what we ended up making is actually a kind of a photo album software. A rather, say, kind of like weird and possibly depressing photo album software. So we collected these photos through an app we made for like just different people to submit moments of everyday life. And these are actually time tagged and geotagged, and they have information associated with them. But let's go ahead and blow this up, because this photo album is really a metaphor for like our memory, but also how fragile our memory really is. And within this kind of sea of shards of memories, we're going to actually bring some things into focus. Here's a memory of someone beating some cans outside of Karma. Here is one of just a photo of somebody's key. I call my key to success. Let's do one more. Lawn mowing magic dragon. Now this is keyed off of Karma, so 2 kilometers away is actually from Karma. And but look at the time. Like this doesn't tell you exactly when it is, but it tells you relative to the present moment. This moment happened 9 years, 1 month, 22 days, 8 hours, 22 minutes, 21, 22, 23 seconds ago, right? So this particular photo album is trying to remind you that this moment, however mundane, well, you're never going to be as close to it as you are now. And this is a thing that's forever receding away from you. And isn't that like all of our memories? No matter how mundane. And in that, like these memories maybe aren't so mundane. Also because we can kind of all relate to this. This is someone looking down their like apartment window, watching a lawnmower. And I know in this case, I think they were listening to Puff the Magic Dragon. And that's why it's called Lawn Mowing Magic Dragon. That was just a moment, a very everyday moment. So this particular photo album is really kind of a database of everyday memory, but also of just memory from different people. But they're so ordinary that we can all relate to them, right? There's someone waiting to get donut or like rehearsing. And you can actually, night can become day. We can induce kind of a flurry. And we can also zoom out. Here's more. And I'm going to turn it back into night. And there's actually a physics engine running here. It obeys Kepler's third law of planetary motion. Things towards the middle are going to rotate faster around the center than things on the outside. And this creates a natural spiral. So this is kind of like a galaxy of collective memory. And this is what the piece actually ended up becoming, because as a piece, this also had sound. And we were taking the recordings of these associated with these moments and then putting them through kind of a sonic blender and then really having kind of an audiovisual experience. And at some point, all these memories converge into a single point and then blow up again. And occasionally they form into the original images. And as a piece, it ends when everything converges into this blob, and it goes off into the distance. Where it goes, we do not know. So yes, this is like, we think this is probably the world's most depressing photo album software. But it's something that is depressing because we can maybe all relate to it. And it's also saying that, hey, maybe there's no such thing as a truly mundane moment. And these moments are something that, well, that make up most of life, right? So this would be one example in that in our limited effort was trying to make a software that had a purpose, but also communicate a kind of understanding of just, that's life. Laptop Orchestra. Now, this question of what design is, if it's an alignment, then I think the next question is, how do we align things well? How do we design well? And this really is a question of quality. And so in the Laptop Orchestra, we, kind of designing well may mean designing in a way that really takes advantage of what the Laptop Orchestra as a medium really is. That it takes advantage that there are computers, but also humans that can be networked, but also have other kind of social relationships and engagement within the orchestra. I feel like at Princeton, this is like the place I least need to explain what a laptop orchestra is, but here we go. Here's a single laptop orchestra station with a laptop, audio interface. At Stanford, ours still sit on an IKEA breakfast tray with meditation mats and pillows. This was directly lifted out of Plurk. I remember Dan expressing this preference that, yeah, we don't want to, most of the time we don't want to be, kind of adhere to the traditional laptop performance model where we're sitting behind a table with wires hanging out from the other side. In this case, we're just on the ground, almost meditative, right? And so, yeah, I saw no need to update that. So again, I think, why change something that works? And then the hemispherical speaker array. And this is very crucial, and this came out of research actually by Dan and Perry that were years before Plurk was actually conceived. It was this idea of, can we build computer-mediated instruments that exhibit sound production qualities that are more akin to traditional acoustic instruments? And this is a statement that physicality of sound matters. If I were to play like a ukulele in front of you here without amplification, the sound would come from the artifact and not from speakers around us. And we would relate to the sound and the instrument and the performance differently because of the way the sound is made. And so this insight really is at the basis of much of Laptop Orchestra as we know it, as it exists at Princeton and now at Stanford. And at Stanford, we built our speaker arrays, which are these things that are supposed to be like point sources that emanate sound from a single point outward rather than having sound come from and surround you, right? We built ours out of IKEA salad bowls. We actually built different iterations, but the 11-inch diameter Blandum mat turned out to be a good size. So we could fit 6 4-inch car speaker drivers in them and perform together as an ensemble. So this is an excerpt. To date, there are probably more than 250 Slork pieces and instruments, and I would imagine even more than that in terms of Plurk's output. that was an excerpt from a piece called Twilight, and really the metaphor for the interactions that we're using these game track kind of controllers to, in a sense, pull sound out of the ground and play with the sound, and then we can kind of put it back into the ground. And the piece is really about based on a short story from 1934 by the same name, Twilight, kind of about like humanity's dusk. That story was set 7 million years in the future, which I think is a rather optimistic time scale. But so this is really, and that particular sunset of humanity was due to basically humans losing their capacity for curiosity because we've automated everything. And the cities are just kind of this deathless continuum of automation. And people have lost the desire for desires. But yet they still long for something they no longer know how to express. And so to do this in the medium of a laptop orchestra is exactly the kind of incongruent and kind of like by design, kind of misalignment that's supposed to actually get you to think about the very medium and how we use technology, right? Now for something completely different, this is the laptop accordion. How does this work? Well, as you might guess, it's actually the front side camera. And we're using optical flow, or computer vision algorithm, to track how fast we're actually opening and closing the laptop. Sound is generated on the laptop and controlled through the keyboard, and of course, the opening and closing of the screen. This is almost certainly bad for the hinge on your screen. But here you go, right? This is kind of, in some ways, this is kind of like Ocarina. It's taking a computing device that we kind of take for granted in our everyday use, and like literally like turning it on its side, in this case, and using it in a different context, musically speaking. So that's a bit of kind of how we think about like this issue of quality, is that like we want to make things that actually play as well as instruments, as we want an instrument to play. Instruments isn't just, clearly we have quality judgments on instruments, right? Not all instruments, not all violins are the same. Some violins are better for certain things than other violins, just like they're better tools for certain things than other tools. Like programming languages are better at certain tasks than other programming languages. It kind of depends on the task. But to make something well is something that takes advantage of the medium, but also can really serve a purpose well within a specific context, right? And this brings me kind of to my the third question that I'm going to briefly address is this question of what does it mean to design ethically, right? Certainly if you think about today in the conversations that we're having as a society and what we see in the media, and also how we're thinking about, as we're engineering like robots, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and as these things continue to reshape almost every aspect of the world we live in. Like, how do we think about this? Well, often we seem to think of this often as like, how do we not do evil? How do the things we make not come back to harm us? Right? And if there's bias that is captured by these automated processes, is there some way to unbias these things? If we recognize bias to be something that's against our values, right? That's one way to think about it, and I think that's absolutely crucial. But do no evil, I would also say, is a very different kind of a goal than do good. In fact, I think there's a world of difference between trying to shoot for do no evil, which in this context would seem like a rather low bar, to like do good. But what does it mean to do good, or to do social good? Like, that seems like a thing to say, to want to say, right? Like, let's do social good, but what does that really mean? Well, I think that's important too. But in terms of design, if there's anything I really learned from computer music here at Princeton, is that there are ethical issues, but it's not necessarily one of these. Like, people are not going to say computer music. Let's make sure that doesn't harm us. And are we doing good? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I like to think we are, but I think what it addresses is a kind of question that I think is much more relevant than just computer music, and it's this question: how do we want to live with our technologies? What if that is really the broadest way we might think of ethics and technology? It's not how do we not kill ourselves or not harm ourselves. These are important. Or even how do we do good, but really what is the vision we would want to have? What kind of world we want to live in? That includes the things we make. And how do the things we make and that we're going to make fit into the world we would want to live in? This applies as much to products, to software, as it does to government, to law, to public policy. These are all artifacts of design, right? And the policies you shape in any design, I think we should recognize that, yes, these things change our behavior. And if we believe that, then in the aggregate, maybe we might also see that these behaviors has an influence, profound influence on our way of life. And that's kind of the pyramid of design. Policy, shaping behavior, and in the aggregate, shaping our collective way of life, right? What if that is how we think about ethics? And what if we think of ethics not as this leash on technology, about what we should not do, but rather the foundation from which we ask, hey, what should we build and how should we build this thing? So Melvin Kranzberg, who's a technology historian, he had these laws of technology. The first one states, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. So that's a good one. His second law of technology actually states, invention is the mother of necessity. Right? Think about that one, and then you think about the phone you have in your pocket. Like prior to 2006, 2007, we didn't really think we needed app-based smartphones. Smartphones existed, but not app-based. Like, what's an app for most people? Now, let's take away everyone's phone all of a sudden, and what are we left with? Invention sometimes is the mother of necessity, and necessity ever continues to be what drives invention. Really, these two are in a kind of a cycle, right? And really, the ethical argument then in artful design, kind of combining this like do no evil, do good, and trying to think about how we want to live with technology goes something like this. The choices we make in design hold implications for our users and are tantamount to taking action ourselves. There should be no different realm, ethically speaking, to think about how we design something, the decisions we make, every feature we build into a product. There should be nothing different from how we would actually treat people face to face. Like, I don't walk up to strangers and punch them in the face because that just doesn't seem like the right thing to do, right? But we tend to think we operate differently when we're designing products, and because we don't see these people face to face, right? But if we do believe this statement, that the things we do in design are no different than if we actually are face to face and we're actually taking this action directly, then this is actually saying we don't need actually necessarily new ethical frameworks. Is that we should actually hold ourselves to the same ethical frameworks, moral frameworks that we already held ourselves to face to face. Extend that to design, because that is no different than face to face. That's the argument. Right, and so that brings me to the platinum rule. So how many people have heard the platinum rule? Got one over there, anyone else? Everyone's heard the golden rule? Yes? Do unto others as you have them do unto you. What is the platinum rule? Would you like to say?
Isn't it that do unto others as they would have done unto them?
Yes, exactly. Do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Now seems like a subtle difference, but that actually might be kind of the difference between, like, by definition, sympathy and something of empathy, right? The platinum rule is like saying, you might be very different from me. You might have very different experiences, but I'm going to do my best to figure out what is it that you really want. I'm going to do my best to kind of speak to that. Right, and if we're to draw from, philosophy, actually this is really essentially what Kant said. in the second formulation of his categorical imperative. He only had one categorical imperative, and he said it two ways. This is the second way. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in yourself or in another person, never as a means to an end, but always as an end in itself. Nobody is a tool, not without their true permission to actually render their services. And we should treat everyone with dignity and humanity. And what if this is the bottom line of doing business, of designing things, right? And is that the kind of world we would want to live in terms of a world that we are continuing to shape every day, right? So that's kind of a tour of kind of the kind of arguments and the kind of things that you would find in artful design, and really what it's trying to get at. So it starts, wackily enough, with pencil bags and computer music instruments, and thinking about this question of quality, but really what it's trying to get at is this question for all of us of like, hey, what kind of world do we want to live in, you know, in terms of the things we build? And those include pencil bags, instruments, but much, much more. You know, all of us design. So one more design. And I'm going to just show you a bit from the book, which I think is really a book for the engineer with a soul. That's, I think, who I wrote it for. And starts in my office, and off we go on this journey with pencil bags, buildings, thinking about engineering as kind of an artful act, as a social act, right? From Ocarina to actually have the principles in designing this, to visual design. Here's Converge, told in story form. Chapter 4 is all about programmability and sound. This is like the really nerdy computer music chapter. Chapter 5 is all about designing instruments, but more broadly interfaces, as this medium that sits between humans and our technology. Where we have theremin playing the theremin, and where we have Rebecca Febrink helping us understand how artificial intelligence and machine learning my work kind of hand in hand with human interaction, human curation, human intervention, how the two can really productively inform each other, right? And finding this balance for AI. There's a principle from artful design that says, well, it's a two-part principle in automation, specifically speaking to AI. It's saying that which can be automated should be automated, except the cases where the things that cannot be meaningfully automated should not be automated. Right? And I think that doesn't answer questions outright, but in the it depends kind of way, it says in each situation, maybe we ought to find this golden mean, this balance between automation and human curation. Right? That's what it's getting at. And that's something that I think directly comes from Rebecca's research on combining HCI, machine learning, and music. And by the way, she got her PhD here as well, and she was a faculty here. So a lot of Princeton in this presentation. Chapter 6 on game design. The game design is more than for entertainment, but for expression, as well as games that help us reflect on our emotions and, you know, kind of our condition. Chapter 7 on social design. The first principle is that we really are designing for human connection, right? And the final chapter starts with this idea that what we make makes us. Now, this is like two parts to this, right? Most of you will probably have heard, you know, kind of the McLuhan, the medium is the message, right? On one hand, it's saying, yeah, well, it's not just what you say, but kind of how you say it. That's one interpretation. But really, like at some level, I think McLuhan is observing that, you know, in terms of what shapes society and kind of human society, the medium actually possibly far exceeds the message. It's what's available for us to use in mass that really ultimately changes the course of human society. If you think about everything from the printing press and how that's changed human communication, to the electronic age of television, to now internet, to think about how mobile phones have changed how we interact, to our so-called social networks. Right? These are things that I think are things that we made are now making us. So this is kind of a fairly somewhat grim, technological, deterministic view on like history and future history of who we are. But perhaps like artful design, I think, is trying to offer like a second side to this and saying, as designers, maybe we do have some say in this. We're not completely without agency. And if we can design by taking into account and knowing that the things we make will shape our behavior and our way of life, then if we take that into account, maybe we can design better. And that we ought to take that into account. And that's this idea of what we make makes us. And that we should design not only from the needs that are perceivable, but from really kind of trying to figure out what the values that's underlying these needs, right? I mean, Ocarina, I could tell you, was not designed from like perceived needs. We did not take a survey and be like, hey, people, we're designing an app. What do you want? And people were like, I want an app that I can blow into and make music, and I would like to hear other people blow into their phones around the world. No, it obviously did not happen that way. It came from, I think, this idea of value of like, music making does a person good. And then this mobile phone can be a goodly democratizing medium to get people to make more music if we believe that is a value, right? So that's what I mean by kind of this value-based type of design. And this also say there, as designers, as engineers, as really humans, there has to be an artistic leap on the part of the designer that results from seeing and feeling the world at large, not just asking it face-to-face directly, right? Designers are less problem solvers and more artists, philosophers, engineers of useful things that understand us. That's really where I think artful design, that's the argument that artful design is trying to make. So in this sense, tomorrow's engineer, as a professor, and trying to figure out like how do we, not only what to teach, but how do we teach this? I feel like tomorrow's engineer has got to be much more than a specialist. It's got to be a kind of technological artist, a moral, ethical inventor, and a system designer that knows that whatever we build, we've got to be able to contextualize it and fit it into a broader world. And world that hopefully more closely aligns than the one we're in to the one that we think it ought to be. Right? And that's not easy, but in general, maybe it's not a bad starting point. So in higher ed, when we talk about different shape letters corresponding to different types of education. For example, we have like the I-shaped student. That's like a student that's like really just narrowly focusing depth-wise on one subject, right? And then someone's like, no, that's not so good. We should have a T-shaped student. You get some depth and you get some breadth. I want to talk about the pie-shaped student. What is a pie-shaped student? Well, on one leg, you can say there's disciplinary expertise. For me, this was computer science. On the other leg, domain expertise. For me, it was music. But for someone else, it could have been public health. But then there's this bar, which I call that the aesthetic lens. This is the philosophical, artistic, and moral lens that gives broader meaning and context in bridging these two legs. And for me, this is a more complete person that I would like, for someone to help educate, right? And this is not a technician. This is a citizen, a denizen of society. And also, to me, this is why engineering, the humanities, the arts, social sciences, these are not separate things. They used to not be separate things. These are not things necessarily glued back together as things that should have never been taken apart. So that's kind of, in terms of education design, that would be nice, right? So I started teaching a course called Think 66. It's for first-year students at Stanford, called Design That Understands Us. And it looks at the nature, the craft, the ethics, the experience, and the future of design, roughly speaking. It was like, well, I want to design a course around artful design now that I've written this book. But then I was thinking about all these other perspectives, just at least a few of the many perspectives we could bring to this, but also kind of across different times, for example, going all the way back to Aristotle. Nicomachean Ethics, his treatise on ethics as a craft, as something you can get better at. And this idea of asking what does it mean to be virtuous? For Aristotle, it meant a kind of functional excellence, right? A virtuous knife is one that cuts well. A virtuous, in general, would be one that wins battles. what does it mean to be a virtuous human? Precipitating the question, what is our function? Right, so that is really like, it's an amazing book, and I would say it's actually more than like some abstract philosophical thing. It may have been the longest surviving self-help book. Like Aristotle wrote this as a practical guide to being like a better person, but motivating it with ideas, right? So the final assignment in this class is actually designing for eudaimonia, which is an Aristotelian idea of human flourishing as kind of the ultimate purpose of human life. And what that means for each person, he says, could be different. But we all seek at the end of the day for a kind of happiness, but a kind of happiness through flourishing, a fulfillment of our capacities. And so the final assignment is to kind of a speculative design, which they don't have to build it, they have to think about this. Make a blueprint or a manual or a manifesto for designing something that, that helps people flourish. Again, speaking to this idea is what kind of world would you want to live in? And how would the things you make fit into that world? And part 2, they got to do a case study for their peer, and they have to write kind of a short-form fictional narrative that places the speculative design into like some scenario, either present or future, perhaps even past. And so that's an example, and people have made things like, hey, here's a ethical corporations for dummies. What is this? I designed an ironic book with a sarcastic and humorous ethicality test. Like, this is, I would say this is an artful design. She did not write this book, but this is speculating. And what do we have? This efficient, kind of a small house, an escape room based on literature, on Phantom of the Opera in this case. Personal voice assistants that really try to like customize itself to your kind of emotions. To this one, I really like this one. This one is kind of a machine learning mediated tool with which you can feed it legal document, and you have a slider that gives you kind of the amount of jargonness with which you can read the output. So this is too much jargon, you want it like 50% less, you dial it down, right? But you have some control over the jargonness of that. It's not just like a simple red button, hey, here, make this easy to read. No, you want to adapt this to what each person might want to, the amount of jargon that each of us might want to see. Food reductor to, this one asks, what if the internet was actually designed for you? Again, this question, what kind of internet would we really want if we could do it all over again? And how different would that internet be to the one that we have? To a modern society simulator. Like this one actually is actually a simulation of how hard it is to be and how troubling it is to be like a member of modern society. And you take on different roles within this society. And to this one, which is kind of a tool for kind of bringing together different points of view, especially points of view that are violently different from each other. And so this is kind of a way to kind of critically think about different points of view. So anyway, those are some of the actual final projects. No one built any of those, but they thought about this. And if they had time, some of them could build some of those things, and maybe they will. So I'll end with 2 things. One is, at some point towards the end of the book, the pencil bag makes another cameo, asking, hey, design is all about purpose, so what is my purpose? I said to make my life more eudaimonic, as in, you're helping me flourish, pencil bag, because it's playful, right? And this is, well, how do I do that? By being a useful thing, I say, and by imparting delight in how you fulfill your essential purpose as a pencil bag in a way that makes me a little bit more thoughtful, and that I find beautiful in itself. All of that is part of what you are. And pencil bag's like, oh, dang. I'm like, yeah, I'm really glad someone went out of their way to design you as you are. Pencil bags don't have to be designed in this way. In fact, I think it's more difficult to design in this way. Someone really had to think this through with the zippers. And the pencil bag's like, yeah, well, me too. I've fulfilled my purpose, functional and aesthetic. And I'm like, well, it must be nice to know what you're meant to do. And this point, pencil bag gets kind of philosophical. and says, yes, in essentialist terms, my essence precedes my existence. I came into being in order to fulfill a preordained purpose. That is the core of my essential nature and the meaning of my existence and of all designed things, at least that humans design. Right? A car comes into being because it already has a purpose it's meant to fulfill. That's why we made it. You humans, however, seems more complicated. I'm like, yeah, perhaps. Existentialism would say our existence precedes our essence. That is, there is no preordained purpose or meaning in our coming into being, which I realize can seem quite sad and depressing, at which point the pencil bag consoles me. On the contrary, I find it exceedingly beautiful. To be born without preordained purpose is to be truly free. I can't imagine anything more free. You get to make your purpose for yourself, right? So in this discussion about design, you cannot get away from this question of purpose. What is a thing for? But from this, as Aristotle kind of did, you can ask kind of, well, are we designed? Are we designing ourselves? And what is our purpose? Like, this is not meant to have a single answer, I don't think. I don't think we can all, as a humanity, agree to our purpose. But these are nonetheless interesting questions to ask. And this is kind of where I think, again, design in like the broadest sense that I could think of during the time I was writing this book. It comes back to us, right? And so at some point, this is actually a true story. Juliana, who's a colleague in philosophy, asked me, hey, Ge, it's actually at a humanities town hall. It's like, Ge, do you think we'll ever have robot musicians? And I'm like, hey, you mean that are as good as humans? She's like, yeah, that's what I mean. I'm like, well, at this point, I was like, I'm talking to a philosopher. I should give kind of a philosophical answer, ha ha ha. So I said, I think we'll have true robot musicians the day we have true robot philosophers. She says, I think she liked that answer. She said, oh, that's because implied machines will have understood something more subtly human. I say, yeah, I mean, isn't music more than notes on a page or sound waves through the air, more than a product? It's also a process with meaning, right? And I think this is really, to say, like, where we are right now is not like, we're not even at a point where we need more answers. We're actually at a point where we need better questions in the first place to ask about what it means for AI to generate aesthetic products that are, is this art? Is this not art? To what extent it is art? Like, these are questions we are ill-equipped to ask right now. But I think more than finding answers, we got to figure out how to ask these questions, right? And it goes back, I think, for me, to this question: how do we want to live with our technologies? Final example. So this is from 2011. We had a karaoke app that was a social karaoke app where you can basically, like an ocarina, you can sing something and it appears on the globe. But on the globe, if you hear something, you can say, I want to add my voice to the chorus in a +1 kind of a way. And these are all strangers. So in 2012, in the wake of the earthquake and tsunami disaster in Japan, a woman reached out from Tokyo, singing a rendition of Lean On Me, and invited the world to join with her. Within weeks, 4,000 people joined in, kind of from all over the world. Presumably, they don't know each other, right? And this is what it sounds like. We all have pain, we all have sorrow, but if we are wise, we know that there's always tomorrow. Lean on me when you're not strong, and I'll be your friend. So this kind of thing would not be possible without technology. But I think, hopefully, if you design it well, the user never notices the technology. And that's, I think, you know, at the end of the day, this question of what does it mean to design artfully? Well, I'm not saying we should all go pick up computer music programming languages and start making computer music, or even making art of some kind. But saying whatever we choose to shape, we can do it artfully, and that goes for every one of us. So that's artful design. Thank you very much for listening.
We have time for some questions. No questions? It's all figured out? We got it all sorted?
have no answer to that.
Question up here. Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
You can do it?
Hi. What is your next project? Or actually, no. Actually, is there a project that you have that, without thinking about any other circumstantial factors, that you'd like to work on?
Currently, we're working on virtual reality and music within VR, and asking what kind of instruments can we build, what kind of musical interactions can we make, what kind of social interactions can we build within VR. I think I do this 80%, 90% out of apprehension that VR may someday take over, and 10% with really sheer curiosity. And also I feel like if the thing is gonna take over, no one's gonna slow it down. So if it does happen, I'd rather it happen with more music than less music. And so that's really the impetus for doing. And then we're actually building, we're thinking about how can we think about VR as a kind of again, artistic, a humanistic, and a social medium. And what kind of things can we build? So working on that, I unwisely I'm thinking about writing more books, but also really the education front. Really, it's really trying to figure out in my limited capacity, what can we help make a dent in that, just like design, right? There's this extrinsic purpose and this intrinsic value. It holds for education very directly. It's well, if you're a student at Princeton or Stanford or wherever, why are you here? What's your purpose? Is it to what extent is it so I can set myself up for employment afterwards? And to what extent is it I'm learning because I'm interested? And how should we look at that balance? Because there's nothing wrong with the first questions, how do I set myself up for employment? That's an existential question. We do need to be strategic about that, but I feel often that can overshadow the second question. And I think, again, there should be a golden mean between the extremes. You can't not think about what you're going to do next and only all in the moment all the time. That's just not who we are either, and that's probably not going to end up necessarily good either if you don't plan at least a little bit. So I think I'm trying to, if the pendulum is too far this way, I'm always trying to teach classes that kind of have ideas that helping people move it back, but hopefully really find the golden mean. So that's those are kind of the three ongoing projects. Also, I'm still trying to be get better at StarCraft, but it's been 20 years since I've been started. I'm still really bad at it. So that one's a continuing journey. Yes.
Where do you see, how does data visualization fit into art design?
It's hugely related, because I think in some sense, design is a medium, as visual communication. It's a communication medium. It's a medium as in it's media. It's something that sits between things. In this case, design is between humans and a purpose, human and a technology. And so I think data visualization is something that is there designed to convey information. That's its purpose. But how you do it, absolutely is a question of quality. And also, at times it can have its own intrinsic meaning that gets you to realize not just the sheer functional way of things, but really the way of things, and so I anything else that's intentionally shaped with an outcome in mind that I would call design. I think data visualization to me is a more specific form of design. I think it's like music composition. I think it has elements of design. It is not design because it's actually much more specific than design. But at the same time, these are all in a sense kind of mediums. And as a medium, it can be designed. Thank you. Yes.
I think in order to perform philosophical thinking through a certain medium, I think there is a way to say A and not A. So how do you see design and scope that you talked about to critique itself?
I like this question. I don't fully understand it. So A and not A, and how does design how do we self-reflect on?
Yes, how do we self-reflect?
Well, I think part of it is this was an exercise in that kind of this was the meditation on design, right? And to figure out I think philosophically we have to figure out what design really is. What are the ways of thinking we can apply to say what design is, right? There's that, and then from there my attempt has been trying to develop principles that capture, not specifically, but in general, like what might be considered like designing well. But then, of course, there's always the chance that I like to think any vibrant field of inquiry should be marked by its insistence and its openness to question its most fundamental definitions. So I think design ought to also undergo that, and I think it's like any other field, right? I don't think there's for example, I would say if you were to follow everything I've laid out in artful design, I'd say you could still fail catastrophically, right? So I think part of this is maybe not trying to couch design as a kind of solution, but to say these are ways of thinking, and that is, I think, a philosophical way a practical philosophical way to think about design. And just kind of morality and ethics, you kind of have to whatever the opposite of move fast and break things is, you got to do the opposite. Slow down and think about what you're really doing, right? And I think if you can know to slow down and have tools with which to reflect on the things you're making, I hope that self-examination has to be an ongoing process. So I think to do any of that, I think we got to know to slow down, and we got to have kind of critical tools with which to reflect on the things we're making. I don't know if that answers your question. I still don't know this A and not A thing, but did I answer some of your question? Yeah. Okay, cool. I'll take it. Yes.
So, should I go?
Please.
Okay. I think it's still evolving in my head. Artful thinking is effective if you take the commercial piece out. If I go back to your example just now that you talked about, the opposite of going fast and stumbling is slow down and think. Now, the reason why the former happens is because there is a commercial
Imperative, yes.
If you're not the first mover, you lose the opportunity, right? So if you slow down, you're actually allowing disruption to happen right in front of your eyes, and just as it's happening in the auto industry, right? Mobility is something which everybody is trying to get a slice of that bigger pie, but each one is going in a different direction. There is electric car, there's Uber, there's 15 other ideas. Now, if we were to apply this, where is this mobility industry going, or how do you separate commercial from the philosophy that we've been talking about?
That's an excellent question. I think you're getting to this question of sustainability, exactly. Right? Like economic sustainability. If the thing cannot sustain itself, no matter how good it is in theory, it's just not going to exist in the world, not for long anyway. So then what good have you actually done, right? So I think the way to think about this, I'm going to try to draw on this board, is again kind of, I think this picture, right? I said design is a kind of policy that leads up to changes in behavior that in the aggregate is kind of a way of life. This is chalk is crumbling before my very eyes. Way of life. Now, if we believe that this is kind of and I would actually add that there's this thing called intention, whatever the heck that is, that's shaping how we do the policy, right? Now, the economic imperative, I think, is that it happens, it's all you really need for economy is to figure out how you can change people's behavior, and you can figure out what you intend to do. If that's all your intention is, it's this. So this is, I think, the economic imperative fits within this behavior. And in many ways, this aligns with kind of human-centered design, kind of in the Don Norman sense, is that you ought to have this cognitive, the things you design ought to fit cognitively with kind of what you're trying to do. And I think Don, without saying, I think, as much he actually is thinking about this, but the way that HCD has been approached is that we kind of forget that there is a higher level here. So economy, I think, really, all it needs is this loop to sustain an economy for good. But I think the danger is that we don't ever think about this. And so let's say, what if we can shape intention by the kind of way of life we'd want to have, right? And I would call this, to borrow a term I just used, the eudaimonic. That's how, now, if this is, I'm down to like a tiny sliver of chalk. If this is human-centered design, we might even call this, let's just call this art, right? And you're saying, like, if you do this, you forget about this. I'm saying artful design, I think, ideally has to exist as a radical synthesis of these two things. Like, SMUL cannot, like, when I'm designing products, what am I thinking about? Like, there's actually two sides. It's always like, how can I make an app that sells like hotcakes? I gotta be thinking about that. How do we market this thing? And really, it's this subtle dance. You figure out what people want, like that's the nature. And then you figure out what values you think people actually really want. And if you can speak to both, I think you've designed something that is actually sustainable, that people would want, would pay for, but pay for in a way that's genuine. Right.
I think the question goes back to her, why aren't you running for president?
But did I answer your question?
This changes the world. I mean, this approach, if everything gets designed with this philosophy, it changes.
Is this on tape? This is great. I'm going to announce my president. No, my candidacy. So I hope it sounds like I answered your question, right? I think you have to take these both into account. You can't, but good design has to. Like, but Ocarina on the other side, that's like the side that's connected to but very separate from how do we make something that sell like hotcakes is like, what are the intrinsic values I can not do without in the thing I make? Because that is why I'm doing this in the first place. And I think, like, it's like education, again, going back to, like, you can't not have, like, you cannot plan for post-graduation. You got to plan for that. But you can't only plan for that. And many people only plan for that, I think, understandably, but I think they might get a job, but I don't know if they're going to be set up as to be happy for the rest of their life, right? So anyway, other questions up there?
So there's somewhere between a question and something that concerns me about this framework, and it centers on the choice of like the Nicomachean ethics.
Yes.
As like, and this eudaimonia, which is so specific to one particular culture, 2019 America, maybe even Silicon Valley. How are we actually being critical and reflective on this as the artist, philosopher, engineer? Like, I actually work in AI and ML in research at Princeton, and I've sort of been asked, like, what do we stop automating? And what does that mean to choose to not automate something? And it goes back to, like, what are we losing as people when we automate simple things? And this is back to, like, what does it mean to flourish? And so there's this kind of like inner loop that's happening within this framework, and I just want to hear your thoughts. Like,
I'm trying to answer. I'll answer the second one first, and I think this goes back to Rebecca Febrink. Actually, it's not like what do we automate and what do we just stop automating. The things that are not meaningful to fully automate, I think my first order question is always, can we break this up into smaller, more digestible, like human interactable steps? Right? Rather than like having like a fully automated button that gives me what I want, like just say with music, like generate me a song that I'm gonna like. It can probably maybe do that to an extent, but would I wanted to do that? And would I get something out of actually having worked on the song myself or having someone else go through the process of making the song? And can I build a system that has both artificial intelligence kind of built in and leveraging it for its advantages with kind of human agency and curation. So that's that would be the step beyond that, would be to think, how do we actually, if it's not meaningful to automate, I don't say abandon it. I think you got to figure out how you can make it meaningful. And for me, like the first order question is, can we put human intervention in there, and in what way? And that would align with that. And so that doesn't probably cover everything. I imagine it doesn't, but that's the kind of thinking I find that we are not thinking enough about in general. I'm not saying you or anyone specifically, but I'm saying, like, I think as right now we're thinking of, as a culture, as a society, we're thinking AIs as like automation. This is like full-on automation, 0 or 1. I think that's the difference between like being binary and being a duality. A duality, I think you can have a synthesis. Binary is either or. But I'm much more of a duality kind of a, maybe it's not even duality, maybe it's a triality. And the question about Nicomachean ethics, I mean, I think, what was the question? Actually, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, sorry, I circled a bit. So what I meant to ask was, how do we be critical? How do we ensure that this flourishing? So, okay, take Aristotle in Athens, where there were slaves.
Yep.
Et cetera, et cetera. It's a terrible thing. This flourishing for him had a very tight definition, as we now have one in 2019.
I see your question. This is an excellent question.
How do we break that loop of sort of self-inward-looking?
So I would say, I would advocate personally not a pure Aristotelian approach. To your question, I would actually advocate, in fact, they're both there in my presentation, I would advocate an Aristotle plus Kant approach. Because if you apply Kant's categorical imperative, treat no other person as a means to an end, slavery is out. When Lincoln said, I would not be a slave as I would not be a master as I would not be a slave. Like that is, I think, really an embodiment of Kant's categorical imperative. And I think, I'm really, like ethics, so I definitely would not advocate a pure Aristotelian model on human flourishing. I love the question. But I suspect for most of us, our own morality, is probably a mixture. I'd probably say I'm like 30% Aristotelian. Like sometimes I'm Kantian. I definitely don't have a categorical imperative, because it's not that categorical. I don't have anything categorical, except I'd say it's when I was a SMUL. I think I found myself that was probably the most categorical, because I was like always the person fighting to put intrinsic value in here, and I found myself surprisingly never swerving from deviating from that. I'm not that consistent in the rest of life. It's weird, but maybe I'm also like 5% stoic. I'm also like, I don't know, I mean, you can probably try to do a pie chart for your own like philosophical, like how much do you subscribe to these, and also in what situations, right? But I think, because I actually totally agree with you, is that like, I would not want to be in Aristotle's Athens. Because there's the things I would not have, because partly because, one, I wouldn't want to be in some of those positions, and two, it's just not right, period. It is not even about whether I wouldn't want to be or not. It's just, that's just not right.
So how do we know what people 1,000 years from now will say about 2019 Silicon Valley? Like, I did not want to be in 2019.
Oh, they're not going to say anything too good about it. If a human even exists in 1,000 years, they're probably going to say some really, like, I think the way to think critically about this, again, is to really slow down, and you have to, like, it's situational, and you really have to take a multitude of perspectives into this. If you apply just kind of Aristotle, like human flourishing, then you have to ask who is flourishing, and who suffers because of certain people's flourishing, right? But if you add that with kind of this everyone is accorded a certain human dignity and humanity, then I think that completely changes the equation. No one can be left behind. Like that's really hard to do, but darn it, isn't that that would be an ideal that you could subscribe to, especially Kant would. He actually was probably more categorical than I imagine most people to be. So I think I'll go back to Professor Astrakhan, is that it depends. And also, I don't know. But maybe but I think the mixture in the situation has to come into being. But like, stop and think about this, and applying different tools for thinking about it is absolutely important. And even if we do everything right, I think we could still like completely mess things up, even more than we've already messed things up. But I would argue that to do it intentionally is got to be way, way better than to do it not intentionally. So, fingers crossed.
Okay, thank you all. Go's going to be upstairs signing copies of his book outside if you're interested. Let's thank him one more time.
Thank you.